If you're a real estate agent that has received a subject to or seller finance or some creative offer on one of your listings and you're wondering how can you vet them out, I want to give you some thoughts here. My name is Courtney Fricky, and I have been buying and selling on creative financing for the last 10 years. And so, as a real estate investor, I'm not a real estate agent, but I have worked with a lot of real estate agents and even done real estate trainings at many brokerages in my area. And so, I really want to help kind of break down with some of my thoughts. And I like to think that I have a very fair and honest approach that is a win-win for all parties involved. So let's talk through it. All right. So the first thing is I'm going to focus on subject to, but there's going to be some ways that you can kind of translate it into the other types of real estate transactions. The riskiest transaction is a subject to transaction. So when you're selling on a creative finance deal, you need to know if that creative finance strategy, if title transfers or not. A lot of them title transfers, and I'll be honest that some of them, if the title doesn't transfer, it can actually change the nature of the deal. So it is something to keep in mind that not all creative financing deals, you know, the safest ones are when the title stays with the seller. Not always the case. So keep that in mind. But a subject to, traditionally, the title transfers from the seller to the buyer. And so it's important to understand, how do you vet that buyer? So in order for a subject to deal to go right, these are some of the things that you need. First of all, you need a seller that is aware and well informed of the transaction. They understand what is going on. They understand the risk involved, for both them and the buyer. And they understand, as a grown adult, they have made the decision that this is the next right step for them. So not only are they well informed and aware, they are also on board. All borrowers on the loan, as well as anyone on title, should be on board and informed. They also need to be cooperative. You're almost like, Courtney, these words are all starting to sound similar. Actually, they're not. I have had sellers before that have been, borderline not cooperative. I had a situation where I had a seller that only his name was on the loan, but him and his ex-wife were in title, and she was not cooperative, almost to the point of causing him to go to foreclosure. And so there was a whole part of that involved, but I needed her to be involved in the transaction because she was on title. So that's important. And then ultimately, you need a seller that is communicative. So the relationship with the buyer and the seller goes beyond just the closing. And so it is important that they understand that part as well. So subject to also, what is also needed. What is also needed for subject to deal to go well is when the buyer, so here are some of the thoughts, is the buyer needs to be aware of what subject to is, and they need to be well informed. I'll be honest, it starts to show when they are not. Pretty early on, they don't know how to actually explain it and all that. The second one is that they know how to tackle the process properly. And I'm a big fan when they know to actually communicate the process and kind of have some conversation leadership. Hey guys, this is what to expect. This is what's going to go on. What another thing necessary for a subject to work well is for the buyer to execute an effective strategy. More about that in a little bit. Um, they need to, another thing for it to go well is that the buyer need to know the risk, and they need to understand that the payment may fluctuate. Like, this is actually really important, that whatever the seller is paying may not be what they are paying. And that is important. I found that to be an issue, where buyers don't know how to fully run the numbers themselves and expect where there may be some jumps. For example, if the seller is living in the house as a primary residence and then homestead exemption falls off, well, that's going to cause their PITI to go up. And then if it's currently owner occupied homeowners insurance, and then it turns to landlord policy, that may also cause, that to go up. Look, there's other things. HOAs and, insurance and taxes can go up over time. I have seen that with this insurance crisis right now throw some buyers off. Basically, it's where they're not where the buyer isn't planning ahead and it actually, again, they need to be prepared that that number is not guaranteed. And then lastly, another thing that is necessary for a subject to go well on the buyer side is they need to make the damn payment, right? And that's actually really important. No matter what, they need to make the payment, even if it's to their detriment, right? If the property's not, whatever their exit strategy is, regardless of performance, they need to keep paying. That's important. So those are things the seller needs, those are the things the buyer need. And then overall, you need a title company that or a real estate attorney that understands this and has the proper paperwork. I have come across some that don't have the proper paperwork and don't know how to use it. So that paperwork is critical in the transaction. And even further, even the insurance company, them understanding it. So the whole team involved, it's important. All right, so that's kind of a 30,000 foot. Let's dive into how do you vet the buyer? And by the way, I have some notes here I keep referencing, so that's what I'm looking at here. So, some things to keep in mind is that ultimately, um, I'm going to give you a series of questions, but here's how. I'm not a licensed real estate agent, but I cannot tell you how many times I've had this phone call. Hey, Courtney, either it's an agent I know or an agent that was sent to me because an attorney talked to them and that attorney said, you know what, I think you need to talk to Courtney because they received one of these offers. And so we jump on a phone call and I say, hey, here are some of my thoughts. Um, so here's a series of questions to ask, but I would say this, I would tell that buyer, we're open to considering this. I obviously I've got to submit this offer to my seller unless you have paperwork stating otherwise, right? That, you can regret you can deny things on their behalf. But um basically I would say, hey, in order for us to consider this, there are some questions I have, and if you're open to answering them, this may be something that we would, seriously consider. Um, again, as a part of, this transaction, these are some things we want to know. So one of the first things is you want to see, like, are they using an agent or are they representing themselves? Did they come to you as the listing agent and say, hey, I want to make an offer, I'll represent myself? Or did they have an agent submit their offer on their behalf? The reason I say that is if it's a real estate agent representing them, you can ask that agent, hey, have you done business with them locally here before? Is that agent local, right? Hey, have you closed other local deals? With this specific strategy, for example, subject to. Hey, have you guys done other subject to deals together? Did you use the same title company before? If so, do you mind sharing which one? And then how do you know how these transactions are going currently? How long ago was that? And let's just say if it was just last month, a few weeks ago, or if it was a few years ago, hey, how's it going? Do they still own that property? What did they decide to do with that? And then if they are solo, I would ask the same questions, but obviously with the real estate agent, you can kind of gauge from maybe professional to professional. Another question I would say is, hey, are you local? And or if you're not local, are you actively investing in this market? And are you experienced? How long have you been investing in this market? A lot of these blind mass creative offers are coming from folks who are out of town and not very active in the local market or aware of the local market. So that's something to keep in mind. So one of the questions I would say is, how many deals have you done locally here? How many years have you been investing here? Which exit strategies have you used locally? So an exit strategy is, a long-term rental, a flip, short-term rentals. It's basically what do you choose to do with a property once you own it. So it's important to understand, hey, which ones are you currently doing, for example, in the city of New Orleans, where you said you have some properties, where you said you've done some deals. Or they may say, no, this is my first time coming into New Orleans. That's also important because they may not know some of the local issues we're facing, like our insurance crisis and our regulations. Um, have you repeatedly used the same title company? And if so, which one? Do you have a contact there that as a referral that I can talk to? Um, and then how are these transactions going currently? Like if you've done subject to in the area and you've done other deals, how are they going? Which exit strategy did you use, and how are they going right now? And that is an important question for me to ask, because it's like, hey, um, what you're ultimately wanting to narrow down is what are they looking to do? So actually the next question is very specific. It says, what is your exit strategy plan for this property? And then shut up and listen. And because here's the thing, I have heard some investors, again, they're out of town and they've got these woo-woo ideas for what may work in the New Orleans market. And you and I, if you're local to the New Orleans area, you know that we have a very unique market and we've had some challenges in recent years. But not everyone knows what all is going on in our local market. So when I say, I've repeatedly said, hey, did you have a title company that you've closed with? So one of the first things I would do is if they said, yes, I have used XYZ title company, then you say, great, who's a referral? And then I would contact them and say, hey, so and so has made an offer in one of my listings. Maybe you know the title company, maybe you don't. And I would say, hey, we have a subject to offer from a client who said they've closed subject to deals with you before. This is their company name, this is their name. Have you closed subject to deals with them before? They said, we could reach out to you guys as a referral, and then say, hey, have you ever had any issues come up from those transactions? And, asking those things, hey, basically, have there been any hiccups? Have there been any, issues with sellers or, you know, any issues that have come up? For example, if someone doesn't make the payment, one option is people have often gone to the title company and said, hey, what can I do? I close this subject to transaction with you, and the person's no longer paying right now. And so a lot of times the title company actually gets made aware more often than you realized. And so those things are important. So that's kind of one of the things I'm looking for. Let me explain some risk and then how you can vet the buyer based on those risks. Um, so, for example, one of the risks is if the buyer is inexperienced and doesn't properly understand how to effectively navigate a subject to transaction. So, I will be very honest and very blunt. As a real estate investor, a creative investor that's been investing creatively for 10 years, both buying and selling, one of the more complex, meaning there's a lot of moving parts and there's a lot to know and understand and navigate, is a subject to transaction. I'll always be the first one to say that not every seller should consider this because it's not the right fit for every seller. But on the same coin is not every buyer should consider this, and it's not the right fit for every buyer just because of all the moving parts and pieces. Now, there absolutely are benefits to both parties, right? To the seller and the buyer. But there's also risk. So it's important that they need to understand those things. They need to understand the process and they need to know how to work through the process. They're like, well, I saw a TikTok, 30-second TikTok video once on subject to, and so I'm just out here trying it, imperfect action, man. Like, not that, right? Like there is risk to that, right? Because if they don't know what they're doing, there is an elevated level of risk that they may do something wrong. So whether it's understanding what to do or even knowing how to do it, there's a difference between knowing something and then having to, it's a skill set of putting into action. Another risk is that the buyer is over speculating. So over speculating is most commonly seen, like for example, I had a guy make an offer on a New Orleans East property, and they were like, we're going to. So when I told the agent, I said, so I told the agent, I said, look, man, ask and see what's his exit strategy. And they're like, yeah, he came back and said he was going to do a short-term rental, and like, let's just say monthly rent was 1,000. And he was like, he was going to charge like 4,000 a month as a short-term rental in New Orleans East. Not acknowledging that like short-term rentals in the East are harder. But then on top of that, Orleans Parish has a lot of restrictions with short-term rentals, and the guy had no idea that even existed, right? So speculating like, oh, I'm gonna do all these grand things, but not actually knowing if you can do those things, right? Another one is again, we had a guy come and he was like, yeah, I'm going to rent the property for, I'm going to do it as a long-term rental. And I'm going to ask 3,500 in a neighborhood where the going rents were like 2,000. And we're like, he was like, well, that's just what I need to get for it. I'm like, bro, that's not how this works, right? Again, over speculating. So a huge red flag should be if there is no equity or negative equity, really low, no, or negative, and then low, no, or negative cash flow, especially if there's no low or negative cash flow and no low or negative equity. If both exist, that is a very advanced deal. Be highly, highly suspicious of that. Another risk is if the buyer doesn't acknowledge or understand the risk. So there are risks for both sides, both the seller and the buyer. If first of all, if the buyer, and one time a broker sent me this, I was teaching my what the heck is subject to a workshop for a brokerage, and afterwards the broker sent me an email, and it was an offer he had received, and literally the investor was from out of town, some Joe Blow out of town, and he goes, if your seller accepts this offer, they'll have, basically they can fly off into the sun and everything will be, peachy keen and perfect afterwards. The investor goes on to say there is literally no risk involved with doing this type of transaction. And it was a subject to offer. Major, major, major red flags. There 1000% is risk for the seller and the buyer for a subject to deal. There's no such thing as a risk-free or a 100% safe subject to deal. And so if they're not even acknowledging it, that tells you they don't know. Or better yet, if they're not acknowledging it, they may not even be forthcoming, right? So that's a red flag for me. So here's another one. And it's if the buyer's undercapitalized, especially if it's a no, low, or negative equity deal. So one of the big risks in a subject to deal is, so traditionally the seller owns the property and they have a loan. Let's just say it's with Chase. And then what would happen is the title would transfer to the buyer subject to that loan with Chase staying in place. So the buyer is effectively getting the title clouded with the seller's loan still staying in place. And you say, Courtney, how can someone sell a property but not pay off the loan? Isn't that an issue for the lender? So, great question. In the actual loan, and the majority of loans have this lined out where there is what's called an acceleration clause. It is most commonly called the due on sale clause. The due on sale clause, basically, it says that in the event that the bank becomes aware that there has been a transfer from the borrower that's on paper, so Jane and John Doe, to some other entity. Okay, it can be a trust, it can be an LLC, it can be an individual's name, right? If they become aware of a transfer, they have the right, but not the obligation, to accelerate the remaining balance. Let's just say there's 29 years left on the loan and there's 300,000 left. Well, they can say, hey, what that process would look like, the bank has the right to make that decision to accelerate the balance. And they can go ahead and say, hey, that 300,000 that's due over the next 29 years, you've got 30 days to pay it. So that is what's called having the due on sale being triggered. That clause, I will be very honest, it is rare that it gets triggered, but rare does not mean never. So let's break that down. If a property is worth 100,000, just for easy numbers, if the property is worth for 100,000, at retail on the market, you could sell it for 100,000. If that's what it would appraise for, if that's what it's worth, and the seller owes 90,000. Okay. So that is, low equity. They have 10% of equity, right? So if the buyer buys it subject to that 90,000, and let's just say the due on sale gets called and they get a letter that in 30 days they have to basically pay off that 90,000. Well, traditionally, you can refinance a property between 70 to 80%. So if it's worth 100 for easy numbers, you could do a refinance for 70 to 80,000. Let's just say the market's tough. So the only refinance they could get was a $70,000 loan. Now, if they owe 90 and they can only refinance for 70, well, then they would need to come up. It's called a cash in refinance, where they have to bring money to the table to do the refinance. And so if it's 70, they owe 90, it's going to be a minimum of 20,000 because there are going to be some loan costs, right? Loan costs, closing costs, some of those things to facilitate the loan. It could easily be $25,000. So it's important to understand, especially if it is a low to negative to no equity deal. If you are a lot more worried, like if you can't vet any of those other things, one thing you could look at doing is saying, hey, can you get a proof of fund letter that you qualify for a loan? Let's just say for the 70,000. And then can you show me proof of funds for the remaining 20, that you could basically effectively do something if the due on sale gets called. Now, I would say this is extreme because the due on sale is rare, but it is an option of how you could vet them. I will say this, there are some workarounds to reverse a due on sale call. But the reality is that is never guaranteed. So investors, I tell you this all the time, that is never guaranteed. So you need to have a plan in case it ever happens. I have never personally had one called. One of my best friends, though, here in the New Orleans area had one called. I deep dived it on my YouTube channel, did an entire two-part series. I did an entire two-part series breaking it down, and a huge part of that was that that basically it was the type of loan it shouldn't have been bought subject to in the first place. So again, all of that stuff matters, right? And um, so that's one way that you could vet the situation. Um, you know, Here's some other thoughts. Agents, if you are ever concerned, like maybe you just don't like, they have none of this, they're not going to tell you about the exit strategy. First of all, if they're not cooperative, you want to be mindful. But if you're like, you know what, we're not getting any other offers on this property, things like that. But you're like, you know what, my seller wants to go with this offer, and you're like, I'm doing my best to educate them, but I maybe just want to build in some safety, almost like those little bumper guards at the bowling alley. Here's what I would suggest. What you could do is that you could, number one, instead of selling as a traditional subject to where the title transfers, you could say, hey, it would have to transfer as what's called a bond for deed. Or in other states other than Louisiana, it is called a contract for deed or land contract. And in essence, there, the title stays with the seller. So in the event that they don't pay, it is not an immediate process, but it can be a quicker process to get the property back and less expensive. That is an option. The investor may say, hey, no, I only want this as a traditional subject to, and they may walk away, right? So understand that that may be a boundary line for them. Here's the other really big risk. In the investor world, there is an exit strategy called a wholesale or an assignment. On a cash deal, you go in and you offer 100,000 on the property, cash, 2 to 3 week close, something like that. And that contract, what the investor does for in a wholesale or an assignment on a cash deal is they go, hey, I've got this contract on 123 Main Street. It is available, let's just say, for $105,000. Where they say, hey, if you pay me $5,000, you can step into my place and buy it for 100,000, presuming that the 100,000 is a good deal. Then the investor would pay them 5,000 to, in essence, basically paying them money to get out of the way. And then the investor closes on it, within the month, and the seller gets their 100,000, the wholesaler gets their 5,000, and the end buyer gets the property for 105. Okay. So that's a cash deal. There is a massive trend right now, and I'll be the first investor to say this, is that I am adamantly against this, is that there is a trend. I don't see a problem when you fully disclose a wholesale deal. for a cash deal because the life of that deal is 30 to 45 days, give or take, right? It might be 2 weeks, it might be 3 days, right? But it's short. With a subject to deal, that relationship can go for years. That transaction can go for years. And so the trend of wholesaling creative deals, whether it's subject to or seller financing, is very, very effing risky. And excuse my language there, but there is a level that it boils my blood because what happens is most of these wholesalers are just getting paid their quick buck and they step outside the way. But, maybe they don't understand subject to, they're not, you have no idea if they're vetting their end buyer. You could vet that person, but if they're getting out of the way, all of that is for none because you don't know who is buying them and stepping into their shoes, buying them out. That person, you don't know if they know what to do with a subject to deal. You don't know, are they speculating if they're capitalized, all those things. And so a lot of the issues come up when someone wholesales a subject to deal. So that is a great risk. I am adamant. I tell investors all the time, do not assign, do not wholesale creative deals. But it is a big trend. I will be very honest. The most common avatar for that is if someone is making a blind offer on the MLS and they are from out of state. That is a very common avatar for someone who is wholesaling creative deals. Most brokers will text me and say, "Hey, Courtney, I just got a subject to offer on one of my properties. Do you mind? Let me know if you know this investor." It usually takes me all of 1 minute to find out that they've already sent me a message saying, "Hey, Courtney, I have a subject to deal coming up in Slidell. Here's the details. Do you want to buy me out of the position?" And it's like the same one. In the greater New Orleans area, there's a few repeat offenders who've made a lot of offers in the greater New Orleans area, and all they're looking to do is wholesale. So there's a reality there that I often tell agents, hey, this is a repeat offender. They are looking to wholesale these deals. That is a major risk, in my opinion, right? And there's a reality there that I tell agents literally build into the paperwork that you cannot assign this contract. You cannot double close this contract. A double close is another form of an assignment. I would also put in there that, let's just say it's Joe Homebuyer LLC. I would put in there that the payments, let's just say you go through an escrow company and they receive the monthly payments, that the only entity that can send payments, is Joe Homebuyer LLC. And then I would also even put in something that like, at the end of the day, that in the event that if Joe Homebuyer LLC, the entity gets sold to another investor, that like, maybe put in some language that it cannot be sold, right? The entity must remain being owned by, this person and their heirs. Because that's also, a roundabout loophole. So I would build in those things. But again, at the mention, if you in any way suspect that they're trying to wholesale, I would straight ask them, are you planning? I would ask them, do you wholesale your creative deals that you make offers on? Do you wholesale these subject to deals? If I were to, look you up or look your company up online and those associated with you, would I find that you're wholesaling these deals, these creative deals? And look, if they skirt around that question, if they can't answer it one way or another, all of that, like it's important to understand, that's a big part. So that's a big red flag for me. And so that's important to keep. So here's going to be, I'm going to start to wrap this up. The best referrals are from folks who are experienced with this buyer's promises. So that's why I like pointing to a title company, maybe to another seller that they have bought from subject to, preferably locally. Again, a real estate agent, someone involved in the transaction. I would prefer not the real estate agent. I would prefer not the real estate agent, especially if they're representing them, because they're kind of tied to the sales transaction and I don't know, conflict of interest there. I am a big fan of saying, hey, where have you made a promise like this before? And I just want to check in and see how it's going. Again, title company, a previous, another seller, subject to seller, and seeing how it's going. One of my biggest mentors, Peter Fortunato, he's been investing since 1965. He's one of the ones who taught me how to do creative deals like Subject to. And he has a red binder and it's got those little clear inserts. And starting in the 1960s, when he made a promise that he would, for example, make payments, whether it's to a lender, whether it's to a seller, maybe it's to the lender on behalf of a seller, like a subject to deal. And what he did was when he made those promises, when he made those promises, but then when he fulfilled them, for example, he paid all the way through on a loan or he paid off a subject to loan and they got the letter back saying that this loan has been paid in full. What he did was he put that in the clear binder and he said, "Look, here's the promise where I made telling the seller that I was going to make them, payments on their behalf or I was going to pay this lender or what have you. And then here's the paid in full, you know, stamped paid in full." And it was basically his book of credibility. It has been one of my favorite examples of look, go look to see where their previous promises are and check in on their promises, right? It's one of my favorite things to do. So, with that being said, this has gone long, but real estate agents, this is, I believe, even with the risk involved, that this can be a good solution, but it really hinges on the buyer, right? It really hinges on, it's really hard. I wish I could just say, go check their credit score, go check and see if they've got proof of funds. But it actually depends more than that. Like they need to actually understand how to do the deal. And so above that, I'll say this, ultimately listen to your gut, do your best, and then when in doubt, again, you can build in some safeguards. Last thing I'll say about this is I'm based out of the greater New Orleans area. So New Orleans, North Shore, Baton Rouge, and even into South Mississippi is where I do business. So if you're a real estate agent and you receive one of these, feel free, go ahead and reach out to me. If you go to CourtneyFricky.com, the top left, there is there's an envelope there. That's how you can email me. You can DM me on socials. Reach out to me. I'm happy to, if you get an offer, I'm happy to say if I know who the investors are or show you how I look them up to see if they're wholesaling them. Or better yet, if you're like, Courtney, I can't, these are people, they're out of town. I don't know how to vet them. But I do think this might be a good, valid option for one of my sellers because of the situation they're in. And if you want a reputable local investor who understands, I'd be happy to look and see if I can make an offer. I have plenty of referrals that I can send you to, as well as my version of the red book and of credibility. And so, whatever that looks like, I'm more than happy. I've done that for plenty of agents, or I've even just said, hey, let me look at the run the numbers. And there's times where I've said, hey, I can't make sense of this deal. It's going to have negative cash flow. It doesn't make sense. I think they're out of their damn mind offering on this deal. And that is actually, me basically not offering has helped the agent understand that this is actually a riskier offer. So that's today's thoughts. A lot of thoughts there. Hope you guys found this helpful. Let me know in the comments below. My goal is just to be a helper. Real estate agent friends, I know that this is a very difficult time. I am frustrated as well with all of these offers being made on MLS. My goal here is to see if I can just help. All right, have a great day.